We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Boy, we have a lot to talk about, so we've cleared the decks. This will be an opportunity to talk about many of these issues and also take your phone calls. You know, we didn't really think there would be a lot that we would be talking about today, other than perhaps, of course, the ongoing discussion about a Supreme Court nominee and some of the questions that are still remaining about the refugee order. But my hometown of Berkeley gave us something else to talk about. UC Berkeley. You know, I'm getting homesick now. You know, it's boring where I live, and it's pretty exciting right there. You know, I grew up in California, and I was born in Berkeley. And, you know, even at the University of California at Berkeley, they had, during the 1960s, what was called the free speech movement. Now, I was just a young kid, but I was actually attending a church almost across the street from Sather Gate there. And so I remember all the emphasis upon free speech. Didn't exactly happen last night when all sorts of riots broke out because of the impending and then canceled speech by Milo Yiannopoulos, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute, and some black-clad protesters creating a lot of stir, so we'll talk about this. Also, a lot of stir in Washington, D.C. about a phone call that President Donald Trump had with the Prime Minister in Australia, and I'll try to explain some of those issues as well. As we do talk about the Supreme Court nominee, one of the articles we've posted here is the possibility of a second Supreme Court pick. The New York Times apparently has guessed that the selection of one of the two is the idea that number two, that would be Thomas Hardiman, is going to be put forward pretty soon, because there is some thought that maybe there will be a retirement, so that Donald Trump in his first year might be able to actually put two on the court. So we'll talk about that. And it's interesting because an individual that's sort of an insider who knows this said, well, I don't know how the New York Times guessed this, but it's true. So I thought, okay, so we're going to get into that as well. While we're talking about California, it wants to not only have sanctuary cities, but it wants to become a sanctuary state. And if you saw the latest poll that has just come out, 1 out of every 3 Californians supports the idea of seceding from the Union. And so, again, 32% favor secession. And so we'll talk about what that might mean and what's happening in California right now. One of the other articles I've posted here by Ben Shapiro, that there's no master plan. It has been interesting that when President Obama was in office, people were saying, well, no, this is all part of his master plan, and he intended to do some of these things, when it looked more like incompetence. And now, as the Trump administration's doing some of this, some of his supporters are saying, no, this is our part of a master plan. And Ben Shapiro said, no, these people aren't as smart as you think they are. So we'll get into that. And then if we have time, and I suspect that may come more into the second hour, a very good piece on who are the real Bible-quoting hypocrites. You know, all of a sudden, individuals that have told us that the Old Testament is something that is from an old or period of time, it's misogynist, it's sexist, it's anachronistic, to put just a few of the key words that are used. And then all of a sudden we see individuals now quoting from the Old Testament Torah, by the way, to justify some of the actions related to the refugees. And so we'll get into some of that. While we're talking about that, of course, there was a national prayer breakfast today, which Donald Trump really spent some time talking about protecting religious liberty, but he also had some things to say about Arnold Schwarzenegger and called for prayer. As we say here so often, you cannot make all of this up. We'll probably leave some of that for tomorrow, because Kelly Shackelford will be with us, and there's a lot going on in the religious liberty arena, not the least of which is that the draft proposal put out by the Trump administration has been leaked. And I'm going to come back to that in just a minute, that there are individuals that are in the bureaucracy right now that were actually appointed by Barack Obama that I think you can make a very good case are trying to undermine this administration. And so, as we've already talked about earlier this week, the decision by Donald Trump to fire the undersecretary, actually the, if you will, the acting attorney general, probably be a better way to refer to her. I think he's going to have to probably encourage a few other people to seek employment elsewhere. But let's talk just about Berkeley for just a second here. We're talking about this attempt to actually disrupt, and it was successful, by the way, of a speech that was going to give by Milo Yiannopoulos. Don't know a lot about him other than I've seen some of his videos and things like that. A homosexual conservative who loves to be provocative. That's putting it mildly. But I love what Alex McFarland said the other day. What's happening at Berkeley is typical of much of the American academic landscape, where viewpoints that counter the accepted narrative are squelched. Violence is incited by a worldview that shows that millennials have abandoned their faith because they are without a solid foundation grounded in truth, and that chasm is being widened in today's colleges and universities. He says the situation at Berkeley is proof that much of American education today is not about education but indoctrination, and divergent views are not tolerated. He says, as an example to all who see violence and intolerance as an answer for their disappointments in the political process, students involved in this violence should be dismissed immediately. And if you say, well, this particular individual is provocative, and he is, and oftentimes says some pretty outlandish things, and he does, let's just remind ourselves that at other universities, including this one, I might mention, wasn't it Jean Kirkpatrick, who actually had served as the United Nations ambassador? She was one of my former professors at Georgetown University. Hardly someone you would call a bomb thrower or a controversial individual, unless you just disagreed with her views. Not allowed to speak. Condoleezza Rice, you might remember, was not allowed to speak. Ayaan Hirsi. There is a growing list of individuals who were actually forced to cancel their speaking opportunities. Others who, when they were then given at least the opportunity to speak, were shouted down. A little bit later, we're going to quote from Ben Shapiro. You can talk about Ann Coulter. Remember, Ann Coulter was at one event, and they then tried to throw a pie in her face, and they missed. And so just to give them a bad time, she said, well, the reason they missed is because those boys throw like girls. She had a lot of fun making fun of them. But nevertheless, if you've been on a college campus, as I have in the past, it was pretty confrontational back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. I'm doing this now too often to get on campus. Not sure we'd be allowed anyway because of the way in which these individuals who are convinced that only one viewpoint, that is theirs, should be allowed on campus, prevent anybody else from speaking. And for those of us that are a little bit older, at least it was ironic for me, having grown up going to a church across the street and occasionally even walking the campus of UC Berkeley when they had what was called the free speech movement, so that there would be a free speech platform where anyone would be allowed to speak. And of course, what they were trying to do is allow campus radicals, communists, Marxists, socialists to have a chance to speak. And this university, which at one time was known for really wanting free speech, today is kind of in the news for not allowing that kind of free speech, even from individuals that in some respects they might have agreed with. Milo is on at least a few issues would find though there was a acrimonious phone call between Donald Trump and the Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull. I'll try to explain that. And as always, we welcome your phone calls. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, nearly 24 horror films are coming out this year, and many of them involve witches. Although these films are fiction, there are unfortunately lots of facts in our kids' textbooks that are presented as fact, even though they're fiction. Rodney Stark, in his book, The Triumph of Christianity, says that no historical statistics have been so outrageously inflated as the numbers of those executed as witches during the craze that took place in Europe from 1450 to 1700. He points out that some writers have placed the final death toll at 9 million, drawing comparisons with the Holocaust of the 20th century. Others have claimed that the witch hunts only ended when the so-called Dark Ages of religious extremism were replaced by the Enlightenment. The cover picture of Rodney Stark's earlier book, For the Glory of God, is a painting of a woman being burned to the stake for practicing witchcraft. This is an iconic image and a potent symbol of Christian intolerance and medieval irrationality. But what are the true facts? First, the number of killed were probably closer to 60,000, which is less than 1% of the off-cited figure. And we should also add that a third of those executed were men, not women. Second, the accusers weren't religious fanatics trying to suppress heresy or rid the world of people who believed they were witches. Rodney Stark explains that often it was the church officials who intervened in witchcraft trials in order to protect the innocent. Third, the period of frantic witch hunting actually took place during the late Renaissance and the Enlightenment. This is but one example of where the historical record has been distorted in order to smear Christianity. And that's worth remembering when we all see the publicity this year for movies about witches. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Rather acrimonious or a little bit tense phone call between the United States and Australia, actually between the two leaders, of course, Donald Trump and the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Now, what it has to do is this was supposed to be an hour-long phone call. It was cut short, and some people said that Donald Trump hung up on him, and they're saying, no, that's not the case. But it was truncated, in part because they couldn't get along on one of the key issues, and this is an issue that goes all the way back to the Obama administration. And that is the United States, under President Obama, agreed that they would resettle about 1,200 individuals that were actually coming to Australia that Australia did not want. And so the idea was that they had been held in kind of offshore processing camps in the Pacific Islands in places like Papua New Guinea and Nauru. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I've heard that mentioned just a minute ago, but I forgot the pronunciation. And in turn, then Australia would resettle some of the refugees from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Well, as Donald Trump is so wont to be, he was rather blunt about this and said, what kind of deal is this? If you don't want them, why do we want them? You know, it's just kind of like, okay, why are we even having this conversation? And so after the conversation made the headlines, Donald Trump went to Twitter, I know that really surprises all of you, and said, do you believe it? The Obama administration agreed to take thousands of illegal immigrants from Australia. Why? I will study this dumb deal, is what he said. Now, there's 2 points to make. Point number one is the fact that we know about this should be disturbing to people, even if they dislike this president, because what it illustrates is what is happening in the bureaucracy right now. And that is there are individuals who are leaking information that they shouldn't be leaking. This one is not of national security interest, but it's pretty obvious that sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later, something like that, which again, as we've talked about with the WikiLeaks leaks and things of that nature, could harm individuals. And Gary Bauer wrote about that just the other day, in which he said, if you look at the Washington Post, even it has been reporting that career bureaucrats are in regular contact with President Barack Obama and Obama's political appointees, getting guidance about, quote, about what they can do to push back against this new president's initiatives, unquote. And again, this is dangerous because in some respects, what you have of the bureaucrats, in a sense, trying to overturn the election and trying to do all they can to prevent the Trump administration from being effective. Now, as Gary Bauer points out, civil servants are supposed to be immune from political pressure, but that's not exactly what has played out. He even talks about during the Reagan administrations how Bill Bennett and he, both at that time in the Department of Education, ran into the same kind of opposition. And it is not easy to remove those individuals, but we might want to think seriously about, or at least Donald Trump might think seriously about, because this was a conversation that was leaked to the press, and then, as best we can now determine, was misrepresented even at that. So are we in a situation now where this president, talking to, for example, the president of Russia, the leader in China, talking to individuals that are leaders in the European Union or in the Pacific Rim, those will be leaked as well. This one, of course, was leaked in large part because it was a way for those entrenched bureaucrats to say that this president has done a great deal of harm in terms of the relationships between the United States and Australia. And so that's the first issue before we even get into the content itself. But again, as I point out, here you have a number of decisions that were made in a previous administration. Donald Trump comes in and says, who made this deal? This is a terrible deal. We can understand the problem in Australia. This last summer, I had 2 interns from Australia, and it just gave me a sensitivity to the fact that, their borders are water, but that doesn't mean people aren't showing up in boats from Indonesia and a variety of other places. But let's just pick Indonesia for a minute. Indonesia has more Muslims in that country than any country in the world. A lot of Muslims in Indonesia probably are real peace-loving, but some of them, again, could be very dangerous individuals, and in Australia, they don't want to necessarily give them an enclave so that they create a sleeper cell that eventually leads to some kind of terrorist attack against the Australian people. Completely understand that. But then is the solution to then send them to the United States, unless you want to send them to Guantanamo, as one of my colleagues has suggested. Maybe, again, if they want to come, we can put them in Cuba. But until we understand and until we can vet these people, we're not any more interested in them than the Australians. And so this is where this conversation kind of unfolded. And if you read a little bit more about this or hear about it today, you might want to go back and look at the history of it. And again, we're probably going to hear people saying, well, we need to open our borders. And this is where Michelle Malkin, in a piece recently, made it very clear that in the past, when she's talked about immigration, there were people that would oftentimes criticize her because she would talk about those people who want open borders. And she would say, well, they do. And they'd say, no, they don't. And then all you have to do is look at all of the signs we've seen that said no borders, no nations, bad word, deportations, no walls, no borders, get rid of the executive orders. I'm cleaning up the language, but you remember what you saw on some of those posters. And again, she says, we have this kind of John Lennon, imagine there's no country crowd, that we don't have to have any kind of borders. And she says, no, not all refugees are welcome here. Muslim extremist refugees seeking to wage jihad on our borders and kill all infidels are not welcome here. Anti-American refugees seeking to transform our society and culture are not welcome here. Those who treat their wives as second-class citizens, believe that they can engage in honor killings are not welcome here. And so the point she's making is the same point I suspect that Donald Trump was making with the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, that if you don't want them in your country, what in the world makes you think we would want them in our country? We'll see how this plays out over the next couple of days. But again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Yesterday, of course, Penedextra did a great job with Nick Pitts talking about the fact that we now, of course, have a nominee. And that is an individual that I think has stellar credentials, Judge Neil Gorsuch. And yet at the same time, there have been some people really wondering whether or not to actually use what's called the nuclear option. Apparently, Donald Trump said the other day to Mitch McConnell, go nuclear because that I would say if you can, go nuclear because that would be an absolute shame if a man of this quality was caught up in the web. And so one of the things that we have posted today is a piece by Mark Thielsen saying Trump should go nuclear on his Supreme Court nominees. So we'll talk about that. And also another article that came out in the New York Times, picking one justice, Trump has an eye on choosing a second. And so there may be some method to his madness, or if you will, a little bit of organization to why he brought two individuals to Washington, D.C., put one forward, but I think the other one is the second nominee, and we'll talk about what that might mean in just a minute. But if you are interested in contacting your two senators, we're going to do an action alert today, but it won't be on this. I think you would certainly want to contact your senators about giving Judge Neil Gorsuch a hearing that is rapid, that is reasonable, that it's respectful, one that is going to provide an opportunity for him to get that up or down vote, and I'm pretty sure that he will be confirmed. So again, if you wanted to contact your two United States senators, let me encourage you to do that on your own. The Capitol switchboard number, if you're not familiar with it, is 202-224-3121, 202-224-3121. You could just then tell them which state you live in and contact your senators. And as you go to our website, you will notice that we do have an action item, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. And it has to do with the fact that there is a way for your elected representative. Each one of you have at least one representative, and of course you have two senators, but your representative to actually move forward to reevaluate some of the regulations that have been passed in previous administrations in ways that people never really understood before. So I'll go through some of that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But before we go to the break, rather than confuse the two, let me just focus my time and attention on that one. If you believe that indeed this new nominee to actually fill the vacant seat, which was left by the death of our individual that served in there before, Antonin Scalia, that if you believe that Judge Neil Gorsuch deserves a hearing, I would encourage you to contact your senators, 202-224-3121. And if you'd like to join our conversation today, we have a lot more to cover, and I will do that after the break. 1-800-351-1212. Posted a lot of articles on the website. We'll come back and talk about them right after this.
Modern life is go, 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 and Point of View is absolutely ready to go with you. I dare say that most of us have access to either a smartphone or a tablet, maybe even a computer that is app-based. There's a new way to keep up with Kerby and the team, the free Point of View radio app. With quick links to listen to the program live, to keep up and share Kerby's meaty and insightful viewpoints, commentaries, read articles on issues we're talking about that impact you and your family. Did you know you can also watch the show? Yes, radio with cameras. You can access that through the app as well. There's a link to our action alerts, how to find us on the radio across the nation, ways to contact us, and so much more. Visit your app store, iTunes or Google Play. Search for the Point of View radio app. There's no reason not to take us with you. The free Point of View radio app, available now for Apple and Android devices. And when you get it loaded, there's one more button I'd like you to press, the one that says Donate Now. Join Truth Team 360. Support us financially as we support you with the truth that you need. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Put a couple of issues on the table. One, of course, has to do with some of the conflict there right now at the University of California at Berkeley, a time when we always heard that this was a place where free speech was allowed, but not for at least a couple of individuals that have been invited to speak and then canceled. Donald Trump, of course, his call with the Australian Prime Minister, and, of course, one of the articles that surfaced in the Washington Post, resistance from within. Federal workers push back against Trump. And we'll get into that with, I think, our first phone call today. Let's go to Robert in Texas. Robert, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, how you doing, Kerby?
Very good. What would you like to add?
Well, when you were talking about the people that are contacting Obama to undermine Trump's agenda, I guess, or what he's trying to do to find out just exactly how they can legally go about, undermining what he's trying to do. Would that somehow come under torturous interference or something?
Well, I think it could be justification for removing them. Let me just again read from the Washington Post. And again, this is something they've uncovered. And of course, others have already seen it. But again, Washington Post, a pretty good source. Less than 2 weeks into Trump's administration, federal workers are in regular consultation with recently departed Obama-era political appointees about what they can do to push back against the new president's initiatives. Some federal employees have set up social media accounts to leak a word of changes that Trump appointees are trying to make. Well, Donald Trump made it real clear that in the case of the Deputy Attorney General, Sally Yates, that when she decided to disobey one of his executive orders, he said, you're welcome to do that, and you're also welcome to go find employment somewhere else. You are fired. It is difficult to get rid of individuals in civil service. I understand that. But let's remind ourselves that this is something that some administrations have been willing to clear the decks. Remember when, and maybe you don't, but certainly some of our older listeners might remember when, interestingly enough, Bill Clinton took office. He cleared all sorts of departments, including the Justice Department. And as I said in a piece the other day that went out under my Twitter account and Facebook account, can you imagine if George W. Bush, less than 2 weeks after Barack Obama took office, began to criticize Barack Obama? How would the press have covered it? Here's another one. Could you imagine if there were still people that were left over from the Bush administration began to undermine what Barack Obama would do? Don't you think you'd have even more than, say, the Washington Post writing about it? So this is something that I think the Trump administration needs to deal with. And there are some who've said, he made a mistake by keeping some of these people in positions of authority. But now that he's getting more and more of his cabinet confirmed, I think it's about time to actually make sure that the people that are actually supposed to implement these policies agree with the individual that sits in the Oval Office. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I think that'd be great, so we can get some things accomplished. I know one thing I've noticed with Trump is he's been speaking a lot more about God, so that's I think a good thing, and hopefully, our nation is under God supposedly, and I guess if you don't like that, you probably ought to find a nation that's under Allah or whatever you believe in.
Let me pick up on that because today was, of course, the National Prayer Breakfast. I know some individuals up there, and I even thought about trying to get somebody by phone to talk about this, but with this issue with the Australian Prime Minister and the Supreme Court nominee, there were too many other things to talk about. But today at the prayer breakfast, for example, Donald Trump said, my administration will do everything in its power to defend and protect religious liberty in our land. He went on another time to say, we will not allow a beachhead of intolerance to spread in our nation. We want people to love us and to love our values. He also went on, for those who are worried about some of the concerns about what was called the Johnson Amendment, which is really in some cases maybe muzzled a number of pastors. He said, I will get rid of and totally destroy the Johnson Amendment. So Who would have guessed that an individual that was featured in Playboy magazine, had 3 wives, and hardly could be the poster boy for some of the social issues we talk about here on Point of View. So far, so good. I mean, there have been a lot of things that I would never have predicted that he has done. I think part of that has to do with who his vice president is, Mike Pence, and some of the other people in his cabinet. But nevertheless, that's where we are right now. I want to talk about the action item, but let me take at least one more phone call. So we'll go to Missouri first. And Mike, thank you for calling us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. I appreciate taking my call. We're calling out here Midwest Coast, out here in Lake of the Ozarks, Missouri, middle of the state.
Beautiful place. I've been there before. I need to get back up there and get to meet you. So.
Oh, it is. It's beautiful down here.
Yes, it is.
Anyhow, it's just so refreshing to see a politician like Trump in office doing what he actually says he's going to do. And it's you know how it is. Those politicians, and they always love to say what they want the people to hear, but they never really do what they say they're going to do. And I think the country, if the people would give him a chance, this country could be back to greatness. And I think we could actually get maybe some of that spirit that 9/11 gave us. I mean, that's what we need.
Now, we're going to have opposition every step of the way. I mean, you've seen it everywhere. It's been in airports. It's been at UC Berkeley. You've seen it out in the streets. You've seen it in the marches. You've heard it on the Talking Head shows. So there have been some people that have said, we really like this direction towards a more secular, more progressive culture and country. And if you start turning it around at all, you're going to get a lot of resistance. So we certainly have seen that as well. But back to your point, Mike, you remember when we, especially in the summer and even fall, had people saying, you keep telling me that Donald Trump is going to do all these things, but how can we trust him? We can't trust politicians, and Donald Trump doesn't seem to be a man of his word. And so, there were a lot of people that had big question marks about who would be in his cabinet, who he might select as his first Supreme Court nominee, what kind of policies he would implement, whether he would make good on his campaign promises. But so far, how do you think he's doing?
Well, personally, at my level, he has not affected my life one bit. But on a national scheme, I think he's doing a great job. He's protecting our country. He's doing what we need to do. We should have been doing from a long time ago. And those refugees over there in Australia coming into our country, that is a joke. That is unbelievable. If Obama wanted that deal done, why didn't he do it before he left office?
Well, some of them were coming in that way. I mean, give partial credit there. But, this is just something to remember tonight if you happen to have a TV set and you turn on your TV set, or you look at your local newspaper, or you go to a website. This was a deal that was done under the previous administration. And Donald Trump has looked at some of these deals like the Keystone XL pipeline, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or this particular one with basically the trade of the deplorables. I'll use the term that was used by Hillary Clinton, but the term used of him. And some of these individuals that if Australia doesn't want them, why do we want them? And I understand why they don't want to settle them in their country, and which is why they're on the islands apart from Australia. But that's not any reason to bring him here either. So, again, he's looked at some of these deals, and, of course, he's going to come back to the Iran nuclear deal and say, again, these are just terrible deals. We don't need to be making those. Who's made these deals? And as soon as he brings that up, then, of course, the Prime Minister of Australia gets his feelings hurt, and I'm saying, I'm sorry, but we're going to do what's best for us, just like you're trying to do what's best for Australia.
Yeah, I just hope people would give Trump a chance, but that ain't going to happen. Our country's just too divided at this point in time. But something will happen. Maybe something will happen really bad, and maybe get that 9/11 thing going back again. Unfortunately,
I hope not. But again, in light of some of the things you've heard people saying over the last couple of days, it's like, do you forget what happened about 17 years ago. I mean, just really, I mean, this is amazing. Anyway, let me just before we take a break say that the other action item we have there is a great opportunity for you to contact your elected representative, because we now have found out, as we talked about last week with Debbie Georgiadis and Penny Dexter, that you have what's called the Congressional Review Act. And it's been on the books, but people haven't been paying attention to the fact that various bureaucrats and bureaucracies need to submit a report to the House and Senate, and then the Senate or the House, and both of them really have 60 days to determine whether or not that particular regulation can be implemented, or even whether it could be reversed or removed. And it says 60 days after the report. Well, a lot of them have never issued the report, which means that some of these regulations put forward by these unelected bureaucrats can be removed. It is known as a regulatory game changer. We'll talk more about it in just a minute, but it's your action item for today. We'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Sometimes our listeners ask why we spend so much time discussing cases involving minority American religions like Sikhs, Native Americans, or Muslims. The short answer is that our mission at First Liberty is very simple. We protect religious liberty for all Americans. But it's also historical. If you look at the body of case law governing religious liberty, some of the most consequential cases have arisen from minority faiths. Wisconsin versus Yoder, for instance, debated whether the state of Wisconsin could compel Amish families to send their children to public school against their religious practices. In the 1980s, the Supreme Court decided Goldman versus Weinberger, examining whether an Air Force regulation violated the First Amendment by prohibiting an airman from wearing his yarmulke. More recently, in Holt versus Hobbs, the Supreme Court examined whether a corrections system could present a compelling justification for allowing quarter-inch beards but prohibiting half-inch beards. And then there's the case with the funny name, Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus Hialeah. That case examined whether a city ordinance discriminated against the religion of Santeria by prohibiting ritual animal slaughter. The bottom line is this: whether it is a mainstream denomination or a minority religion, religious liberty for one is religious liberty for all. And the loss of religious liberty for one religion is a loss in liberty for everyone. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We will continue our conversation in the second hour in case some of you call in and we don't get to you right away. And we'll spend a little more time talking about a couple of these other issues. But the first two articles that I just want to mention before I go back to the phones are available to you. One is by Mark Thiessen, an individual that is involved in the Bush administration, but he makes a really good argument for the fact that maybe it is time to get rid of this idea of the filibuster, to essentially go nuclear. And he says there's no reason for Donald Trump Trump and Senate Republicans not to go nuclear. Senate Democrats have already made it clear of their intention to stonewall his nominee even before knowing whom he plans to nominate. And so, of course, he wrote this a day or two ago. And the reason he says that this is reasonable is back in 2013, Democrats broke a nearly 4-decade-long precedent and changed the Senate rules to eliminate the filibuster for executive branch nominations and appointments to the federal court or district courts, allowing them to be confirmed by a simple majority. This was done, as you may know, so that indeed President Barack Obama could stack the federal courts with these liberal judges. And this is in primarily the federal courts, the circuit courts, but especially the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, because that's kind of been the farm team for the Senate to actually put people on the Supreme Court. And they actually review all sorts of federal laws and cases. And if you want to see how successful changing that rule was, when Barack Obama actually took power, there are 13 circuit courts, I might mention, and when he actually took office, 10 of the 13 circuit courts had conservative majorities. Now, 9 of the 13 have liberal majorities. So you can see he was able to really stack the courts. Well, if indeed this is the case, then he makes the argument that it would be likely that all you would need is 50 votes from the Republicans. There's 52 Senate Republicans. You'd only need 50 because, after all, the Vice President, Mike Pence, could cast the tie-breaking vote. You could essentially put someone on the Supreme Court without a Democratic vote. We already, of course, have seen that last count, I think, was 7. Democrats said that they would not call for a filibuster, so you might have the 59 you need, because 7 plus 2 is 59. You have one more, you might not necessarily need that. But nevertheless, if you'd like to read a little bit more about that, we've posted that article because it's a possibility, maybe not this time, but next time it might be necessary for that nuclear option to be used. And that's the second article we've posted here, because the New York Times, and in particular Peter Baker writing for this, said in tapping Judge Neil Gorsuch for an open seat, Donald Trump chose a candidate with the potential to reassure Justice Anthony Kennedy, the swing vote who holds the balance of power on the court, that it would be safe for him to retire. He goes on to say the idea is to show Justice Kennedy, who is 80, that should he step down at some point, Donald Trump would select as his replacement a nominee similar to Judge Gorsuch and not one so inflammatory or outside the mainstream as to be unacceptable to Justice Kennedy. Although certainly more conservative than the justice, Judge Gorsuch once clerked for him and has his enduring respect. Matter of fact, I think when he was actually sworn in that circuit court, Anthony Kennedy flew out to Denver to actually attend that particular meeting. And so that is something that has appeared in the New York Times, and somebody who's sort of on the inside said to me, I don't know how they figured it out, but that's true. And so when you saw that both Donald Trump brought to Washington, D.C., both Thomas Hardiman and Neil Gorsuch, I think in some respects it was a way of saying, okay, as soon as Anthony Kennedy steps down, or it's possible Ruth Bader Ginsburg steps down, she will turn 84 in March, or as soon as Stephen Breyer steps down, who is already 78, then we already know who the next nominee would be. So that's just a little bit of the inside baseball, but because that affects you, I wanted you to know. And what Mike said just a minute ago was really telling, and that is, I see some of the things Donald Trump's done. It doesn't affect me yet. And that's the point. A lot of these policies are not going to affect any of us immediately. But if you lower the corporate tax rate and more business comes here, if you have the Keystone XL pipeline and it generates more jobs, if you actually have some Supreme Court nominees that are going to no longer allow the country to continue drifting leftward, and if you have some of these economic changes that are going to take place, I think we're going to see our incomes rise and some of the other concerns decrease. And again, if nothing else, just imagine, you might say, well, it doesn't really affect me whether Australia and the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull wants to send more than 1,000 of these refugees, in quotes, these immigrants in quotes, to the United States. Well, that would affect you if they came and settled next door to you. So those are some things to pay attention to, even though it's at the national level. Sometimes it affects you in ways you never saw coming until they move next door or they affect your paycheck. But let's go back to the phone and give a few more of you a chance to join the conversation today. Michael in South Carolina on the Good News Network, thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Kerby. I've been listening to the discussion, and I think that we're all encouraged with Donald Trump's new nomination to the Supreme Court, and I think we can all agree, or many of us can agree, that abortion, just from our hearts, the values of most of the people that listen to radio stations, which you are broadcast on, would be that abortion is probably our number one concern. And so glad that he nominated this fellow, and of course interested in seeing what he's going to continue to do as we go forward with abortion and continuing to make progress for life and making life important in our country. But another issue that's really important, I think, to a lot of us is our national debt. And yes. I haven't really heard him talk a lot about that. And I don't, some of the Republican presidents that we admire the most really kept our debt up. And, and looking especially in the Old Testament, where the God is blessing Israel and saying, "You will loan to other nations, but other nations will not loan to you." And some of the globalists or liberal elites think it's good for us to be in debt, and would almost make fun of us and saying it's healthy for the economy and it's good. But I think the Bible really boils it right down there in Deuteronomy to say, God thinks it's good for us to maybe lend, but not to be in debt, and we are slaves to the lenders. So in our personal lives and in our national lives, I just want to encourage all of us to get out of debt, and to encourage us to get out of debt as a nation, and even if we have to sacrifice. So I think Donald Trump, I would like to see him speak to that.
I would too. Let me just mention for those of you that would like to read a little bit more of the facts and figures on that, I did 2 commentaries in the last couple of months. First of all, one that I did November 18th, because I pointed out that during the presidential campaign, we didn't hear from either of the candidates much about the national debt. And that commentary, which is available on our website, November 18th, National Debt and Liability. But then afterwards, I also did one in January 23rd, Deficits and Debt. And the reason I did that is because you have the New York Times columnist and also Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman, who before the election, when he was sure that Hillary Clinton was going to be elected, said the national debt is not a big issue. We should just keep spending to actually help our infrastructure. And then less than 2 months later said the national debt is a real problem. Of course it is now, because it's only a problem for Republican presidents. So, again, those are 2 articles I would highly encourage you to read. And I'd also encourage you to visit our website, pointofview.net. We have our action item today. We have some of the articles we've mentioned, and we'll continue this conversation. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We have a lot more to cover, but I have one of those mandatory breaks, so we'll be back right after these important messages.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy. But by God's grace, it is happening, one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention a few things that we talked about in the first hour. We have a lot more to cover today, but at any point, if you'd like to join the conversation, you're free to do so. 1-800-351-1212. We talked about some of the conflict there at UC Berkeley, and again, this has been a place in the past that was supposedly a place for free speech. Of course, we recognize that Milo Yiannopoulos actually was not, or Yiannopoulos, excuse me, I mispronounced his last name, was not allowed to speak. And in the past, we've seen, Jean Kirkpatrick and Condoleezza Rice and all sorts of other people have been prevented from speaking at various universities, including that one, UC Berkeley. We also talked a little bit about the little bit of an acrimonious phone call between Donald Trump and the Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, about whether or not those various individuals that they did not want to bring to their country that were held in islands off of Australia could be brought to this country. That was a deal set up by the previous administration, and Donald Trump sort of said, why would we want them? If you don't want them, why would we want them? Who made this trade, which would require us to resettle up to 1,200 of these individuals that are in these offshore processing camps in the Pacific Islands in a trade for you to take some of our refugees from El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras. And so that phone call was supposed to last an hour. It didn't last quite so long because of that. We also talked about the Supreme Court nominee, Judge Neil Gorsuch, and whether or not the Senate would have to exercise the so-called nuclear option. I think that will not be necessary this time, but I think it will be necessary the next time because, as we point out, according to the New York Times, there is very good evidence indeed that Donald Trump is expecting to put a second individual on the court fairly soon. So we'll see where that plays itself out as well. And one of the things I just sort of mentioned in passing, but I wanted to come back to, and maybe I'll post this article tomorrow on the website so you can see it. Washington Post, where they say resistance from within. Federal workers push back against Trump. And one of the paragraphs says, less than 2 weeks into Donald Trump's administration, federal workers are in regular consultation with recently departed Obama-era political appointees about what they can do to push back against the new president's initiatives. Some federal employees have set up social media accounts to leak word of changes that Trump appointees are trying to make. A little bit later, it talks about that at a church in Columbia Heights last weekend, dozens of federal workers attended a support group for civil servants seeking a forum to discuss their opposition to the Trump administration. About 180 federal employees have signed up for a workshop, which will take place, I guess, this weekend, where experts will offer advice on workers' rights and also how they can express, are you ready for this, civil disobedience against Donald Trump. So as you can imagine, there are a few people that had to weigh in with this, and one of those was the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, in which he reminded everybody that there was analysis done by Hill, and that's the newspaper that kind of covers Capitol Hill, and that analysis by the Hill newspaper showed that 95% of campaign donations from employees at 14 federal agencies went to Hillary Clinton. And so he says this is essentially the opposition in waiting. He said Donald Trump may have to clean out the Justice Department because there are so many left-wingers there. State Department is even worse. So just a few of the very interesting articles that have surfaced. And while we're talking about some of those changes, let me, before I take a phone call, mention that our action item for you today on our website is a way that your member of Congress, your representative, actually can begin to deal with some of those issues. And it all has to do with something we talked about last Friday, and that is there is what was called the Congressional Review Act. And I've actually looked at the legislation, even looked at the writings that have come out recently by the individual that drafted it. It's actually been on the books since 1996, but people have not really paid attention to the fact that it requires that when you publish a regulation or even a guidance, one of those guidances was this idea that we're going to reinterpret Title IX, and so when it says sex, that means transgender. So all the transgender rules came from this reinterpretation. Well, anyway, the Congressional Review Act requires that as you publish a regulation, you send a report to Congress. And then Congress has 60 days, basically, to determine whether or not they would revoke it or remove it or modify it. And that has been sort of done in the past, but people fail to realize that the law says that 60-day clock starts either when the rule is published or when the report is received by Congress, whichever is later. Many of these bureaucracies have never sent in a report. So that means you could possibly go all the way back to 1996 in the Clinton administration. Certainly you could go back to the Bush and Obama administration. And if there was a rule or regulation that you disagreed with, require the agency to file a report, then Congress would have 60 days to determine whether or not it would pull that report. So this has become what many people call a regulatory game changer. The other day, of course, Donald Trump actually required that for every new regulation, you had to remove 2 regulations. But this one allows you to go in and deal with some of these, which are regulations, or in the case of, as I mentioned, a guidance. That all the transgender rules were called guidances. And if there was not a report issued on that, well, you can see what would happen there. So this is an opportunity for you to express your opinion to your representative. Most of us tend to know who our 2 senators are. Many of you that listen to this program may know your representative, but if you don't, that's good news. If you just put your name and address down, the computer will pop up who your representative is. We've got a suggested piece of email to send to that individual. You can modify it as you wish, and then hit send or submit, and then you will have done your civic duty. So if you'd like to join the conversation, let's take some phone calls. We'll go to Arizona. Donna, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you very much for taking my call. I want to let you know I appreciate your program, and the information that you give is awesome. Listening to your program, I'm wondering if there's, in your opinion, if you see the makings of an undercurrent here with a civil war, another civil war in our country. On one hand, to defend the Constitution and the moral principles that it was founded on, and the other is, the opposite side, the liberals that want to change America.
We certainly are a divided country. Now, the reason we had a civil war is because those divisions were geographically connected, the North versus the South. The disconnect now is a little different, but let's at least acknowledge that I don't think we're headed towards a civil war, but we do have some similarities, not the least of which I mentioned in the first hour. And if you've just joined us, let me mention that there was this new poll that came out. This comes from the San Francisco Chronicle, and it was a poll done by Reuters in which it found that this poll of Californians found that 32% of people in the state of California actually approved of the idea of peaceful secession. It would be willing to secede from the Union. Now, I don't know that would happen. The only way it could happen would be probably you'd have to have a constitutional amendment. But nevertheless, you have the California Senate President Pro Tem Kevin DeLeon, as well as Anthony Rendon, and they said, we will lead the resistance to any effort that would shred our social fabric or our Constitution. And some are saying, maybe it's time for California to leave the United States. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, nearly 24 horror films are coming out this year, and many of them involve witches. Although these films are fiction, there are unfortunately lots of facts in our kids' textbooks that are presented as fact, even though they're fiction. Rodney Stark, in his book, The Triumph of Christianity, says that no historical statistics have been so outrageously inflated as the numbers of those executed as witches during the craze that took place in Europe from 1450 to 1700. He points out that some writers have placed the final death toll at 9 million, drawing comparisons with the Holocaust of the 20th century. Others have claimed that the witch hunts only ended when the so-called Dark Ages of religious extremism were replaced by the Enlightenment. The cover picture of Rodney Stark's earlier book, For the Glory of God, is a painting of a woman being burned to the stake for practicing witchcraft. This is an iconic image and a potent symbol of Christian intolerance and medieval irrationality. But what are the true facts? First, the number of killed were probably closer to 60,000, which is less than 1% of the off-cited figure. And we should also add that a third of those executed were men, not women. Second, the accusers weren't religious fanatics trying to suppress heresy or rid the world of people who believed they were witches. Rodney Stark explains that often it was the church officials who intervened in witchcraft trials in order to protect the innocent. Third, the period of frantic witch hunting actually took place during the late Renaissance and the Enlightenment. This is but one example of where the historical record has been distorted in order to smear Christianity. And that's worth remembering when we all see the publicity this year for movies about witches. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Very good question that we got from Donna just a minute ago. And again, I don't want to overplay this idea, but you can see that the growing tensions between the various states and even the different ideologies have really manifested themselves in pretty significant ways. Certainly looking at the fact that a third of individuals in California support the idea of seceding from the Union. Again, that's not going to happen, but it, I think, illustrates one of those tensions. And Victor Davis Hanson, who's been on this program so often with us a while back, wrote about what he called It's a Mad, Mad California, because he talks about kind of the paradox. California is the golden state, but it hasn't become a golden state in terms of what's happened in the legislature. Having grown up in California, father ran for the California Assembly, having seen some of the transformation before I left, it is really stark now, because he says nowhere is this paradox truer than in California, dysfunctional natural paradise in which a group of coastal and governing magnificos, virtue signal from the world's most exclusive and beautiful enclaves. The state is currently experiencing another perfect storm of increased crime, decreased incarceration, still ongoing illegal immigration, and record poverty, all that energized by a strapped middle class that is still fleeing the overregulated and overtaxed state, while arriving poor take their places in hopes of generous entitlements, job servicing the elite in government employment. And he, talks about, if you do travel to California, how stark the differences are. He said Pebble Beach or La Jolla is far from Madeira or Mendota as Mars is from Earth, because you have people along the coast of California and other enclaves enjoying incredible amount of wealth. And on the other hand, you can go into other parts of the California, where there is incredible poverty. He goes into that in some detail. Even talks about, that he says most of us in rural California today go to town to mail our letters because our rural boxes have been vandalized by gangs so frequently that it is suicidal to mail anything from home. He says many of us now have armored, bulletproof, locked boxes for incoming mail, and he gives all sorts of stories about what it's like to live in the rural area. He lives on the same farm, I believe, that is 5 generations old, but it also illustrates the flight from California. He says go to a U-Haul trailer franchise in the state. The rental trailer return rates of going into California are a fraction of those going out. Surely never in civilization's history have so many been willing to leave a natural paradise. I mean, California's a beautiful state, but the problems that are surfacing there kind of, again, illustrate some of the tensions that Donna was talking about. And back to this issue of debt, I am so grateful that Michael brought that up, because we see that in terms of personal debt. In my most recent book on money, and even in my most recent book, I should say, with Harvest House, and then one of my most recent books with Christian House Publishing, I talk about this because in Proverbs 22:7 it says the borrower is a slave to the lender, and I did mention my commentary on debt and debt and deficits on January 23rd. But the point I think we need to make is that some of these states are running up debt, and these pension funds are running up debt. And there's a point at which we won't be able to fulfill those pensions. And then if some of the states which have had some of the problems with these pension funds, Illinois, California, to mention 2 of many that I've written about, they're going to say, well, we need the federal government to actually bail us out. And that's when I really start seeing kind of a civil war, because there are other states that are going to say, no, wait a minute, we ran our pension fund effectively. We were actually very frugal in terms of how we balanced our budgets and how we met the needs of our citizens. Sometimes we had to be fairly frugal. We had to be very careful about how we spent the money, and we're not really too interested in bailing you out now because you have had such generous entitlements. And so there's where I think those conflicts are going to surface even more so. So, Don, I think you're really on target, and whether you look at the debt issue that Michael reminded us about, or you look at some of the social changes that Victor Davis Hanson writes about, or even just the latest poll there saying that, well, almost a third of people in California are willing to have the state of California actually secede from the Union. If indeed it would do that, I suspect for a while it would survive, but it would also have to deal with some of those issues that right now can be maybe ameliorated or benefit from some of the connections to the federal government. But nevertheless, you have the Cal exit, kind of like Brexit, have Cal exit. And so there are people talking about that. And doesn't that remind us a little bit of the Civil War? If nothing else, one of the things I want to encourage you to do is give us a phone call if you'd like, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Jacob in Georgia. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yeah, thanks, Kerby, for receiving this. I just want to say that America and the whole earth should be rejoicing today, especially Christians. They should rejoice all over the earth for what God is doing through President Trump. He is fighting against the enemy that is the enemies of the cross, the enemy of God, the enemies of Jesus, and he's voicing out the pain and the hurt of the persecuted church all over the earth. And I think if Christians were to stop looking for President Trump to create miracles and start seeing what opportunities that he is presenting, and get up off of their lazy butts and get out into the streets, the highways, and the hedges, and spread the good news and assist him in giving us the freedom of the First Amendment and all of our amendments. I think we can make this world a better place.
Right now, the people seem to be out in the streets of those who oppose him, but we'll see. And I think that's a good word to encourage people to let's make a nicer way, get off their blessed assurance and make a difference in the community. And that is certainly something we would encourage you to do. We want to equip you and empower you to make a difference in your life, in your community, in your family, in your church. Let's go back to the phones, and we'll go to South Carolina this time. Joan, thank you for joining our conversation.
Hello, Kerby. Thank you for taking my call. The comment I'd like to make is that I think that the Republicans and the Democrats should work together in the best interest of the people. I think that if there's a nominee who is not agreeable with the total public, then they should all vote on one accord. For example, the educational director had a lot of calls that she was inexperienced in everything, and it really did go about as being something that the Republicans should have gotten with the Democrats, and they should have all voted on one accord. However, that did not happen. But bottom line is the best interest of the people is what's at stake, because the president is serving at the liberty of the people. It's not his White House. It's the people's White House. And it should be looked at that way. He should be behaving himself in that way. And as a Christian, I pray for that man. I don't know him, but I pray for him because the Bible says we must pray for our leaders. And I pray that God will, prick his heart and let him see the error of his ways, and govern accordingly. But we must all know that and realize that he is something more important than his being White House president. He has a soul to be saved, and we all need to pray for that, for him.
Sure. And you mentioned Betsy DeVos. Right now, Betsy DeVos has no Democratic senators that said they would vote for her. And we have at least 2 Republican senators, Susan Collins from Maine and Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, that said that they would not vote for her. So unless something changes, if there's one accord, it is one accord that would say that Betsy DeVos will not be the Secretary of Education. So maybe that's a fulfillment of one of the things you just said.
Yeah, I just think they should all get together. I'll just keep praying and ask other people to pray and let that man know, the previous caller know, that we already have a constitutional right. The Constitution is already written, so nobody has given us any rights. The Constitution is there for us, so we just need to exercise that right.
I'm ready.
And I thank you for your show and all that you do, and the lady that checked you in is so nice and polite. Give her a raise.
We will do that. Everybody around here deserves a raise. And since you're in South Carolina, and also I just mentioned, I talked to Jacob a minute ago in Georgia, we're going to see if I can make another trip out there. I've had a chance to meet some of you and shake your hands, and we're looking forward to that. Of course, I just mentioned some in California. I'll get back to that state as well. And, of course, we are going to have a cruise to Alaska. But more importantly, I know I'm also going to be speaking for our friends at KJNP in October. So we're looking forward to all sorts of opportunities to get to meet some of you face-to-face. We need to take a break, though, and we've given you an action item. It's on the website, pointofview.net. More about the Alaska cruise there as well, and some articles we've posted. We'll take some more phone calls right after these messages.
Modern life is go, 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 and Point of View is absolutely ready to go with you. I dare say that most of us have access to either a smartphone or a tablet, maybe even a computer that is app-based. There's a new way to keep up with Kerby and the team, the free Point of View radio app. With quick links to listen to the program live, to keep up and share Kerby's meaty and insightful viewpoints, commentaries, read articles on issues we're talking about that impact you and your family. Did you know you can also watch the show? Yes, radio with cameras. You can access that through the app as well. There's a link to our action alerts, how to find us on the radio across the nation, ways to contact us, and so much more. Visit your app store, iTunes or Google Play. Search for the Point of View radio app. There's no reason not to take us with you. The free Point of View radio app, available now for Apple and Android devices. And when you get it loaded, there's one more button I'd like you to press, the one that says Donate Now. Join Truth Team 360. Support us financially as we support you with the truth that you need. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. Don't forget that on Friday, which is tomorrow, we will have our weekend edition. Penedexter, Kelly Shackelford. We'll get back into some of these religious liberty issues, get Kelly Shackelford's assessment of Judge Neil Gorsuch, as well as the possibility of a second Supreme Court appointment. And he's kind of in the inner circle, so he knows some of these things, and some he can share on the program. Some he can't, but I'm looking forward to that. Penna Dexter did a great job yesterday, and we'll have a chance to hear from her again tomorrow. And let me mention that we have a couple of articles that we post every day. One about the Senate should go nuclear in terms of the nuclear option. We have one called A Second Supreme Court Pick, which I mentioned before. One other one by Ben Shapiro. I just want to mention it real quickly, in which he says there's no master plan. And I really appreciate him writing this because over the years, whether it was George W. Bush, whether it's Barack Obama, or now Donald Trump, there are people on both the left and the right sometimes that actually attribute a great deal of genius to individuals that may be just somewhat ineffective or incompetent or inexperienced. And a good example, he says, is this week when the Trump administration rolled out this really moderate, if you will, executive order that had a pause for bringing in individuals from 7 Muslim majority countries. But the point that he says is that instead of just saying this was inexperience or incompetence or whatever, he says the right suggested it was part of a Trumpian 4D chess play. Donald Trump had suckered the media into becoming unhinged, therefore promoting his agenda to keep America safe. On the other hand, those on the left, he quotes from one individual that said that this was launched by Donald Trump as an early trial balloon for a coup. So he says, according to the right, Trump and his team are geniuses of Newtonian magnitude. And according to the left, Trump and his team are evil geniuses of Darth Vader magnitude. He says this isn't anything new. During the Obama years, supporters of Barack Obama convinced themselves that every move that Barack Obama made was a masterful manipulation of the political system. When he failed, it was the American people who failed. Whereas the right attributed it to Barack Obama's satanic powers. He couldn't just be screwing things up like a self-assured narcissistic control freak. He had to be a political alchemist intent on securing a third term for himself in the White House, a man on verge of opening FEMA camps. And you've heard some of that even on our program. And one of the things Ben Shapiro says, and then we'll go back to the phones, is one of the great lies of the last century came courtesy of Woodrow Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson, who, along with others in the progressive movement, argued that government was staffed by the best and the brightest bureaucrats of creativity and knowledge, men and women who could direct government from the top. Well, the reality is they just aren't that smart. Hate to tell you, I've met a lot of them. They just aren't that smart. And if nothing else, you know, this is one of the advantages of going to an Ivy League school and knowing some of these individuals, even those people that are kind of scary smart, and I've met some of them. Some of them don't have the people skills to be very effective. And a lot of them, they may be smart in one area, and they're just really, really dumb, if I can be blunt, in another area. And so sometimes when we think that these bureaucrats are just really brilliant people, or that these politicians are really brilliant people, they're really not. And I just think Ben Shapiro's piece was really good. It's a good way to kind of set aside some of these conspiracy theories once you realize that the people that you're attributing all this intelligence and all this foreplanning, that it really isn't the case. And I thought you might enjoy reading that. Ben Shapiro wrote a very good piece. It's entitled There Is No Master Plan, and we've posted it on the website of pointofview.net. Let's go back to the phones. I mentioned going to Alaska. I'm going to be in Alaska, it looks like 2 times this year. And Laura's from Alaska, so what would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, I just wanted to agree with the man that talked about the Civil War comment. It's very clear that we're right back there again in terms of what the people want. And restructuring, I think that a revisit to what occurred there and how it applies to today, even spiritually, would be a very good review of who we are and where we're really going. And then, that said, there's an awful lot of spiritual change that's going on. The Donald Trump, I so appreciate much, and there are things that I don't necessarily agree with. However, I'm one, and there are many, and I don't get to make the decision. So that's good because one can be in control.
Sure.
And so I think that I had heard early on that a prophecy about Donald Trump was circulating the internet, and that he would win, in fact. And it was quite an impressive one. And I thought, well, I'm not going to naysay. I'll wait and see. And sure enough, there he did. And so I think that an awful lot of what we have today is looking at where we're going, where we've been, and some intelligence in shaping what will happen, because we are at a crossroads again. And I just really warmed my heart to hear someone talk about the Civil War, and we can look back and really learn from all of that.
Well, I might take that up as a topic and maybe get a few other individuals. There was this one writer that had suggested that if these trends continue, that the United States might fracture into different regional governments that would eventually make the North American continent look more like the European Union. In other words, they'd still be bound together, but there are certain commonalities. But back to the question that Donna asked, the Civil War in part was driven not only by the differences in philosophy, but the geographical differences. And so in some respects, you can see how certain parts of the country coalesce, the South, the Midwest, the West, but if you were to look at those that have commonality, some of them are very divergent. The people in New York and California might have more in common than anybody in between, but they're not contiguous. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays itself out. But Laura, appreciate your comments, and maybe we'll come back to this idea of, are we in the midst of a civil war that maybe is not going to look like what we had in the 19th century, but nevertheless could be something that is going to fracture America. In the meantime, we've been talking about California, so I thought I would focus a few calls on that. Let's go first to Illinois, WPEO. And Evelyn, what would you like to say about California?
Yeah, we were just out there in August, and we were really struck by the amount of homeless people. We were in San Diego, and I mean, it was just unbelievable. We're at the Giant Stadium, the cardboard houses. We stayed at a hotel out just not too far from the airport, and my husband and I put his swimming trunks out on the banister of our hotel, and his swimming trunks were stolen, no big deal, by vagrants. And obviously they have a problem because the hotel said that that's probably what happened to them. Like, I just had no idea. And then we were struck by the amount of people that were homeless all over. It wasn't just in the bad sections of town. It was in predominant places where you'd see people pushing a grocery cart down the sidewalk in a nice area, in the business part of, San Diego. We were just really surprised. And then we talked to somebody at the Reagan Library. It was actually almost disheartening to go to the Reagan Library and see what a statesman he was and how he pulled our country together, and wanted to work for the people, as opposed to the last 8 years. I feel like that Barack Obama did nothing but polarize our nation.
Well, again, I would have to say that two of the presidential libraries that have been very encouraging to me are, of course, the Reagan Library and then the George W. Bush Library, because that happened during 9/11. And so there's some times in which you see America kind of somewhat unified, although let's recognize when Ronald Reagan first came into office, he was vilified as much, maybe not quite as much as Donald Trump, but similar. But nevertheless, there are some striking opportunities as we go to these various presidential libraries, and I've tried to go to as many as I possibly can when I'm in the region, because it's just fun to learn a little bit of our history. And also, I think it's helpful for the younger generation to remember what America was like not so long ago.
Well, I remember when I was young, when Reagan took office, I voted for him. Actually, I got married in 1980, and he was shot in 1981, right after my first child was born. Anyway, and I remember people telling me before he was elected that he was going to get us into a war. And they so vilified him. They called him the Teflon president. And then when he died a few years back, I was struck when the news media talked about him being so great. And then, but when he was in office, it wasn't that way. And another thing that I learned at the library, we stayed in a hotel close from there. A couple there that were from California talked about how the homeless people get a check from the government. And I'm like, it's not working for them.
Yep.
I mean,
Got to take a break, but again, homelessness in California, also in Hawaii, part of it is it's such a nice climate, and if the entitlements are available, it's hard to get anybody to go and do anything else. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Sometimes our listeners ask why we spend so much time discussing cases involving minority American religions like Sikhs, Native Americans, or Muslims. The short answer is that our mission at First Liberty is very simple. We protect religious liberty for all Americans. But it's also historical. If you look at the body of case law governing religious liberty, some of the most consequential cases have arisen from minority faiths. Wisconsin versus Yoder, for instance, debated whether the state of Wisconsin could compel Amish families to send their children to public school against their religious practices. In the 1980s, the Supreme Court decided Goldman versus Weinberger, examining whether an Air Force regulation violated the First Amendment by prohibiting an airman from wearing his yarmulke. More recently, in Holt versus Hobbs, the Supreme Court examined whether a corrections system could present a compelling justification for allowing quarter-inch beards but prohibiting half-inch beards. And then there's the case with the funny name, Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus Hialeah. That case examined whether a city ordinance discriminated against the religion of Santeria by prohibiting ritual animal slaughter. The bottom line is this: whether it is a mainstream denomination or a minority religion, religious liberty for one is religious liberty for all. And the loss of religious liberty for one religion is a loss in liberty for everyone. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Evelyn was talking about homelessness, and we'll probably talk about this again, but I looked it up because I've heard this before when I've been in Hawaii, and so I wanted to get my facts correct. Between October 2014 and November 2015, the Institute for Human Services actually offered for a homeless person in Hawaii to be flown anywhere, a one-way ticket to any one of the 48 contiguous states, and they were able to fly about 133 homeless people back to their homes in the mainland. But they basically decided to kill that. First of all, because it is somewhat expensive, but more importantly, because it was hard to get takers. Just think if you're in Hawaii and you are in a nice climate and you have a way to kind of support yourself, and you maybe aren't even interested in leaving. And so that, I think, illustrates why you probably do see more homeless in places like Hawaii and California. Probably not as many homeless people that you see in Minnesota. And every year when I go to New York and Vermont, I found when we were up in Lake Placid, the guy was saying, well, we don't have any homeless up here. We also don't have much crime. And I said, why? He said, well, because we have, and what was that year? He said, we had 15 feet of snow. That kind of diminishes that a little bit. So that's part of the reason. But also, again, some of you want to speak to this issue of California and succeeding from the unions, seceding from the unions. Let's go to Texas, KBJS. Laura, thank you for joining our conversation today.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I just had a couple of comments, and one of them is if you consider the demographics of California, how many illegals would be considered in that count of the percentage that's saying they want to secede? And, you know, it is a gateway for all the immigrants from the East, you know, coming over there. We have large communities there of different Asian and Middle Eastern communities as well.
Sure.
Don't necessarily agree with our laws.
The number of languages in, for example, the Los Angeles School District are mind-boggling. We're not just talking about Spanish or Vietnamese or Chinese or Korean or Japanese. I mean, those are just the starters. It just is something that, in some respects, as we've pointed out before, California could indeed be its own country. I think it'd be about the fifth largest country in the world if it were separate. And so don't think it would happen, but it, again, is sort of surfaced because of the poll, but also because a few of you have asked questions about whether or not this looks a little bit like a civil war. Not necessarily civil war, but if there could be a peaceful secession, at least a third of California agrees that that might be a good idea. And there are probably a lot of people on other states that say, okay, if you want to become another country, if that would ever be possible, we might go along with it, because then we feel like it would change our demographics and our presidential elections and all sorts of things. So kind of intriguing. Let's, if we can, go to another caller in California, KYCC. Jacob, what would you actually like to add to our conversation?
Hi, Kirby. Thank you for taking my call. So I was just listening, thinking about the California seceding from the Union, and I'm from California, like you said. I'm from Northern California, and it doesn't take someone very long to understand that the political climate of Northern California and Southern California are complete polar opposites.
Very true.
If one were to travel to California, Southern California, there'd be a stark difference if they came to Northern California. So a lot of this political rhetoric coming from Southern California kind of couples in from the people of living in Northern California as well. You've heard, you know, political conspiracies that California will be divided into two separate states in and of itself. So basically what I'm saying to comment is living in Northern California, many voters, especially when it comes to election time, have been disenfranchised, as it were, because everyone knows that California is going to vote blue. They're going to vote Democrat. So a lot of Northern Californian people don't vote because they feel like it's a waste of their time. And if the Electoral College was just split, not even going as far as California seceding from the Union, there'd be a much more balance, I'd say, of at least the electoral system. I don't know. Is it a plausible thing? Will Northern and Southern California ever divide? I'm just calling to get your thoughts on that.
Well, again, that is a key issue, because you have to recognize right now, because California essentially has 55 electoral votes and they all vote in block, you have a situation there, which you have in other states as well. I mean, if you're somewhat liberal and you live in Texas, you know that 38 are going to vote the other way. Or if you're conservative and you're in New York, you're going to say, well, 29 are going to go that way. But because it is so much more, 55 is a lot more than the Electoral College number of New York of 29 or Florida of 29. That's part of the issue. And so some people have wondered whether or not you would divide it. I have no idea, Jacob, maybe you do, of where you would divide that line. And as soon as you do, you have another issue, because Southern California is dependent in large part because of the water in Northern California. And if that had to go across state lines, that's kind of a big issue. But also, if indeed I take this survey seriously, it seems like some just simply say, we just want to completely disconnect from the rest of the United States. That's not something that anybody can actually believe is going to happen anytime soon. But it is kind of interesting to show how divided the American people are, and even the citizens of the state of California. If you were to divide Northern and Southern California, you can give me real quickly where you think that dividing line might be?
Well, if you go on the way to Disneyland, I know that's an arbitrary point, but if you go on the way to Disneyland, there's actually a point where there is a palm tree and there is a pine tree. And that actually is the dividing point. There is at least a landscape aspect, a dividing point between Southern and Northern California. And I'm not saying that that's a good political line to draw. I'm just saying that's already recognized, the palm tree representing Southern California, obviously, and the pine tree representing Northern. I guess the point, just really quick, is yes, New York does have liberals and it has conservatives, same like you mentioned about Florida as well. I think it's that there is a stark difference, not necessarily that they're liberal and conservatives, but in Northern California, I travel a lot for work. I see Donald Trump paraphernalia everywhere, and I can count on one hand I have ever seen anything that promoted Hillary Clinton. But yet California is so overwhelmingly blue that it just kind of seems like the northern part of the state isn't really getting the voice it needs. And that's all I really have to say.
Well, you had some good things to say. And, of course, this conversation we may pursue in the future just because of all the phone calls I received. And for those of you that just got on your phones right now and said, well, I want to get on, and well, we're out of time. But, you know, we have our Friday weekend edition. And let me just mention that we've posted some of those articles about, of course, the Supreme Court, the one, No Master Plan by Ben Shapiro. Never got to the one on who are the real Bible-quoting hypocrites, but that is there for you to read, and we'll get to that in the future. Don't forget, our Friday weekend edition is a great opportunity for you to join us. We'll have Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford. But my action item for you today is to actually let your representative know about this, if you will, regulation game changer. This says that the 60-day review happens when the report is actually listed. And so that means that there is a real possibility to go back and find some of these regulations that might have seemed like a good idea at the time, but really turned out to be disasters. And so your member of Congress needs to recognize how much power we have put in his or her hands, and you should let them know that, and that's why we have that action item up there today. Don't forget, as I mentioned before, we have our Alaska cruise, and we have all sorts of great resources for you on the website, so let me encourage you to go to pointofview.net. Let me also encourage those of you that did not get through to give us a call tomorrow, and that will be a great opportunity for us to hear from you as well. I want to thank Andrew and Tina and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for our Friday weekend edition.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world. And in addition,